like to invite you as we come now to God's Word. We want to be continuing on in our Esther series. Esther chapter 4 today, and we certainly want to welcome anyone who watches on YouTube. And I just was really blessed recently when someone had said that they, although they aren't here, they watch it every time. They watch it every week, and that's really, really good. And as always, you're always welcome to come visit us face to face as we continue on. Esther chapter 4 today. What we're going to do, I'm going to sort of kind of get it started. Then I'm going to ask Russell if he can come up and read for us Esther chapter 4. Let's just begin to think about this as we continue on in this particular story, this particular event, this particular chronicle, as we like to say it. I sort of almost hate to ask this question. How do we react? What do we do when we get news that is awful news? How do we react? What do we do? I know because we are emotional people, we often will react very emotionally. And that's okay because God designed us as emotional people. But we're all different. We're all different. And there are people who when they receive such news, they just go off the rails. And be floods of tears and all kinds of things happening day after day after week on week. There's others, like my mother, bless her heart, who just approaches things matter of fact. And it just happens. I remember when my mother had passed away from cancer, and then her sister had gotten the same cancer. Oddly enough, a few years later. I can't remember the timing exactly. But then one of my cousins said this. She said, when my aunt, goodness, the brain goes. When my aunt got her diagnosis of cancer, and my cousin made a response to it, she said, well, that's just like Mom, just kind of taking it matter of fact, no tears, no nothing. She said, well, this is just God's plan, and I'll soon get to see the Lord. Wow. But we approach things all in different ways. So as we come to Esther chapter 4, we're going to see something on how news gets out. There's absolutely tragic news on what the response is, and then we're going to see a plan that develops. Russell, can you come up, please, and read for us Esther chapter 4.
When Mordecai learned that all he had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went as far as the front of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her, and when the queen was deeply distressed, then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and take his sackcloth away from him. But he would not accept them. Then Esther called Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, whom he had appointed to attend her, and she gave him a command concerning Mordecai, to learn what and why this was. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the city square that was in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay in the king's treasuries to destroy the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given to Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain to her and that he might command her to go into the king to make supplication to him and plead before him for her people. So Hathach returned and told Esther the words of Mordecai. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a command for Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king, who has not been called, he has but one law: put all to death, except one whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. So they told Mordecai Esther's words, and Mordecai told them to answer Esther, "Do not think in your heart that you will escape the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jew from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go gather all the Jews who were present in Shushan and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him.
Thank you very much, Russell. I appreciate that. Extra points and double salary, by the way, for getting all those names. So good. It's a challenge. It's a challenge. Today we are looking at this particular passage. And by the way, there are some papers in the back. I put some words up here if you want to follow along. I'm a real keen fan of that, because I think anytime you write something down, whether it's these words or your own, that helps to engage with what is going on. We're going to sort of break this up into two areas. The first we're going to call a time for tears. A time for tears. We had looked last week at Haman's conspiracy, or remember we called it a cunning plan. Remember that? Haman's cunning plan to do away with all of these Jews. Now, the one he was really after was who? Mordecai. He was after Mordecai. But seeing that Mordecai let the word out that he was a Jew, now we don't know if this is Haman's mind or not, but he thought, listen, I'm going to just take care of all of them. So now we find out that the word gets out. Verses 1 through 9, the word gets out. Mordecai learns about Haman's plan. I wonder if it is because of his nationality that he let out in chapter 3, that he was a Jew. But Mordecai learns about Haman's plan, and all of a sudden, the tears come. Everywhere that the decree is made known, people get in such an understatement. Now, can you imagine? Can you believe that? Is that believable? Is it believable? Of course it is. Of course it is. In the Second World War, as Hitler's plans sort of started to develop, and Jews started to be taken and putting into what's the word I'm looking for? Concentration camps. But before that, it was the ghettos. The ghettos. They certainly knew that something was up. Certainly. And as word got out of Auschwitz and all the various other death camps, I'm not using even that term, that certainly that any time they got on this train, even though the Nazis tried to hide it, there must have been incredible fear. It must have been within their hearts and their minds. So now it is, this word gets out, this decree made by Mordecai and given the golden stamp from the king, that on a certain day that all the Jews going to be killed. I can't imagine. The Bible says that they actually put on sackcloth and ashes. People from all around. Sackcloth and ashes. Have you ever heard that term before? Yeah, we have, of course. Sackcloth and ashes. What is the point? What is the point? What is sackcloth? Okay, well, it's cloth made for sacks. Yeah, simple as that, okay? Cloth made for sacks. And like Jana says, it is roughly woven, probably made from goat or camel hair. Very, very uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Can you think of anyone else who walked around? Okay, Job certainly put on sackcloth and ashes. John the Baptist walked around in clothing made of camel's hair. Remember all that? But sackcloth was a very, very rough material. You can find these burlap sacks, the same kind of idea. Can you imagine having that against your skin day and night? Can't imagine it. Can't imagine it. There is no style to it. Very plain, but the discomfort and pain certainly would have been there. Why would they do that when they're having this emotional pain, this psychological pain? Now they apply physical pain. Why would they do that? Well, it's a sign of mourning. It's a sign of sadness. It's a sign of terrible things that's going on. But then there's this thing of ashes. What's this thing of putting ashes on top of your head? What's that all about? Well, ashes is what's left over from something that is burnt. So I think the symbolism is this, that my future, my life, the things that are around me have burned down. And this is what's left that I put on the top of my head. And the psychological, the spiritual, the emotional pain that I'm experiencing now I want to display on my body by having this sackcloth. What a difficult thing it must have been. What an awful thing it must have been. As Mordecai heard about it, as the word went out, says that from every province, can you believe that, Aurora? Everywhere where they went, here it is, these people. Sackcloth and ashes had become the national clothing for that period of time. What a terrible thing. So then, as we come to verse 4, Esther hears something about it. So Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her. Remember, the eunuchs were the ones who had been serving Esther as a protective situation, probably. And the queen was deeply distressed. Then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and take his sackcloth away from him, but he would not accept it. Now, quite probably, Esther would have been protected from all the outside news because she was the queen. Why the king would have wanted to keep her as happy as possible. She knew something was going wrong. She knew something was going on because Esther wanted to know why was Mordecai had these ashes on his head. Why was he walking around in these kind of clothes? So she said, listen, I need to get online and I need to find something for Mordecai so he get out of those sackcloth because certainly he must be uncomfortable. Maybe he's run out of money, maybe something. So I don't know. So luckily, she found Amazon. They delivered next day. And she said, Mordecai, here's some clothes. He said, no, I don't want it. She said, what's happening? What's happening? So she sends one of the eunuchs to meet Mordecai. And he then tells her what's happening. He tells her the plan from Haman that on a particular day, on a particular month, the entire Jewish nation, as it's living in that area, throughout all those provinces, remember, we're talking about the Persian Empire. We're not talking about a village. We're not talking about a country even. We're talking about huge area. Huge area. All of them would be wiped out in a heartbeat. For our sisters from Jamaica, what would it be like if you got word that for whatever reason all of your family, all of Jamaica would be wiped out in a heartbeat. How would that feel? How would that feel? I can't imagine. I can't imagine. But that's exactly what was going on here. But Mordecai refuses those clothes, and he then shows the eunuch this written decree, this piece of paper stating what was going to be happening. They were in deep mourning. They were in deep time of great sadness of what was happening. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. This thing about mourning. I'm not talking about the kind that happens at 6 or 7 o'clock. I'm talking about the M-O-U-R-N kind. Okay? This is part of being human. Part of being human. Now, I'd like to speak to the blokes for just a second. I know we're in England. I get it. But there's a message out there that a bloke ain't allowed to cry when you're sad. Okay? I know we're in a mining village as well. We're in a mining village as well. I understand that. But you know, if you're out and you whack your hand with a hammer or your finger, I want to cry. And if something hurts physically and it's okay to cry, then why is it bad if something hurts emotionally? You're not allowed to cry. That's rubbish. You can throw stuff at me later if you want to, and that's okay. Just not while we're on YouTube. Okay? So I'd like to give you permission, all you men out there, that as life happens, that it's okay to shed a tear. It's okay. As a matter of fact, I think it's healthy. I think it's good. Why is it that death is so painful to us? Why? And I've said this for a number of years, and I still think it's true, is that God did not design us for death. We were not designed for death. Way back in the Garden of Eden, God provided them the tree of life. He also gave them the tree of the knowledge of good and evil to make a choice and so forth. But God designed the tree of life. And I'm not sure how it all would have worked, but I'm actually convinced had that incident with Satan not happened in the garden, then Adam and Eve would be alive today. Okay? We were not designed for death. We were designed for life. The Bible says that Jesus came to give us life and to give it abundantly. Isn't that good? That's good news for the believer. That's good news for the believer. So we have this thing of death that comes to it, and we're not designed for it, and it's difficult to deal with. Now, here's the reality, that people mourn in different ways. But please, it is perfectly fine to mourn. Don't feel like you have to, when something happens, you lose a family member, you even lose a dog. Or if you've ever had an animal, one of the times it's been most difficult for me. Now, of course, my mom died and all that sort of thing. But boy, when you have an animal, a dog or a cat that you grow close to, it becomes sort of part of the family, doesn't it? And it's okay to mourn over those sorts of things. So don't ignore it, but be willing to work through it. Here's what I've discovered. Sometimes people don't want to work through it. I remember a lady who was a part of the church years ago. She lost a son. I never met him. She lost a son in his early 20s. And every time Mother's Day came around, she would go off on a bender. She would not even recognize her other son. She would not want to even think about Mother's Day because of the pain that it brought. Now, I can understand that it's painful. I get that. But what's sad is that here's a mother who is a mother. And she didn't want to celebrate Mother's Day because of a loss that she had. She never worked through it. So if you're sitting here, even in that sort of situation, that you've never been able to process a loss, maybe of a family member, maybe of a spouse, maybe something else, you've never been able to process that loss, I'd encourage you. Now, I'm not Mr. Expert, but I'd be happy to sit and talk with you or find you someone who's a bit more qualified to sit and work through some things. But it's okay to mourn. It's okay to process these things. But please, come out on the other side. Come out on the other side. I too struggled with Father's Day. Most of you know the story. My dad did a runner when I was 10. I've seen him 5 times in the last 50 years. I have no idea whether he's dead or alive. It'd be very easy for me to say, this whole thing of fathers, this whole thing of Father's Day, don't want to touch it with a barge pole. But here's the thing I've discovered. What I wanted to do was be able to say, you know what? He wasn't a good example, but I want to be a good example. I want to be a good dad to my children. And it's been kind of nice, actually, because in a village that maybe struggles with being a dad, there's been lots of opportunities to be sort of a surrogate dad. You understand what I'm talking about? You understand what I mean? Mm-hmm. Lots of opportunities, and I'm thankful for that. It's sad that that had to happen, but I didn't want to push aside, throw away the idea of being a dad because of my rubbish experience. So I'd like to encourage you, work through those things. Understand that mourning and sadness is a real thing and that we can overcome. And by the way, not only does mourning need to happen maybe with the loss of a family member or the loss of a pet, there's all kinds of things we can mourn over. Loss of a job even. All kinds of losses. Maybe the struggle of coming to a new country. Mourning, exactly. We don't have the climate that you have in Zimbabwe or Jamaica. You can mourn over that, okay? So, Lisa and I went through the same thing. And matter of fact, when I was talking to people, they say, actually, England is a bit strange because of folks, of doing what I do. Say you would get off, and the word that came to me says, when you come to England, you get off the plane as opposed to going to some other country, some other country. You get off the plane, and I can actually read the signs. And I can understand 95% of what people said until I started talking to Chris. Then it went down to about 30%. I'm doing better now, Chris. I'm doing better.
So it took 20 years?
Took me 20 years, but I finally got there in the end. But he said that the issue is that coming to England, the culture shock doesn't hit you till about 2 years later, till you understand that people think differently and maybe value things differently and how they look at things differently. And I thought, what are you talking about? Then I thought, after 2 years, I thought, you're right. So I had to actually work through a bit of mourning for coming away from the culture that I knew to come into a new culture. All kinds of things. So don't push that aside. And we've actually gone through this, but let me just throw this out. Normally people would say there's 5 stages of mourning. That of denial. The denial of the fact that something happened. I lost a son, or I lost a daughter, or I lost a wife. The denial stage. Then there's the anger stage. Why did they leave me? Why did my son die? Why did my dog die? You get angry. Then there's the bargaining stage sometimes, or the what if. What if I would have looked after this person better? What if I would have been a better husband, or a better wife, or a better this, or I've done this differently? And we bargain with ourselves. Then quite often comes the depression side. That I've had this loss, how am I going to continue on? And then hopefully we can come to the acceptance of, and I love this little phrase, of a new reality, of a new way of doing things. There's a whole lot we could talk about that, but I think as Mordecai and as the nation of the Jews is going through this incredible period of mourning, I think it's important for us to kind of pause, take a little bit of a side note, and understand how important that is. Because as people, that's who we are. That's who we are. But then we're going to come to verse 10 through 17 and look at the rest of this. Because it was then a time for tears, but now we got a time for a plan. Not just a plan, a cunning plan. starting in verse 10. Then Esther spoke to Mordecai and gave a command for Mordecai. And all the king's servants and the people, I was going to say, and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty together. No, we won't go there. And the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court. Now, what did Mordecai say? Esther, listen. You're the queen. Why don't you... so this is actually plan A. This is actually plan A from Mordecai, from verse 8. Esther, listen. Go and talk to the king because you are the queen. Why? He'll listen to you. He'll do what you want because you're the queen. That's a good plan. Esther, we got a problem. We got a problem. Then, coming into verse 10, coming to this situation. And the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called. He has but one law. Put all to death except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into king these 30 days. Oy. Mordecai, I don't like your plan. I don't like it. You know the rule that if the king summons someone, if they get the royal invite, then all's good. If I show up unannounced, off with their head. Off with his head. And did the king have that kind of a power? That kind of power? Better believe it. Ain't no one going to say anything against the king. The king or the emperor of the Persian Empire. The word empire sounds big, doesn't it? It was big. It was big. Verse 12, so they told Mordecai Esther's words. Then Mordecai told them to answer Esther this way. Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the rest of us, all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time of this. Possibly one of the most famous phrases in all the book of Esther. Mordecai says, listen, Esther, the command is to kill all the Jews. You are a Jew. Therefore, you will die as well. You may say, now hold on, Eric. Matter of fact, you may say that.
You hold on, Eric.
Thank you very much, Chris. You may think, she's the queen. Certainly she's not going to be part of this law. Now listen, there is something, if you look in the Bible, the law of the Medes and the Persians. This is a very high standard that whatever applies to one would apply to everyone, full stop. Now could the king change? Well, I guess it's possible. We won't ever know. We won't know. But Mordecai says, Esther, if you think you're going to escape this, you got another thing coming. And to your family as well. But he says this. He says that deliverance will come from another place if you choose not to do this. Now, we've been talking back and forth a little bit about that God has not actually ever mentioned all throughout this book. Not mentioned. Prayer is not mentioned, although fasting is. And I was talking to someone well, if you're fasting, is prayer implied? Could be. Could be. But we don't know. We don't know. Was Haman meaning that God would provide deliverance from somebody or something else? I don't know. Possibly he's thinking some other Jew, some other army could come riding in and put down the king. I don't know. But he did have some level of faith that, and maybe this goes all the way back to the covenant. Remember the promises to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all those things? That God had a plan. And I think Mordecai said that I'm going to trust that God has this plan. And then, as Esther said, as Mordecai continues speaking to Esther through this eunuch, he said, Esther, do you realize that it's possible that God has put you in this place of power, this place of influence for such a time as this? Esther, have you thought about that maybe that you have risen up to this position of power to be able to do the work that no one else could? That's pretty amazing. What a thought. What a thought. Is it possible that God could have arranged all these things, all this background story, such that now Esther's queen, and she could be the one to save the Jews? That's pretty amazing. That would mean that God is in the business of arranging things and moving things around that's going to honor him. Okay? Now let's borrow that idea just a little bit. Could that mean that in God's plan that the three sisters have been moved to England for such a time as this? Is it possible? Is it possible that God has a plan for you three in some way that's far bigger than a job? Is it possible? Is it possible that you are sitting in the chair that you are today and you never thought, maybe God has a bigger plan for me at RCBC that I never even dreamed about? Is it possible? I think it's possible. Do you think Esther thought, I'm going to be into this harem. I'm going to be called queen. And one day I'm going to save the Jewish people. You think she thought like that? Of course not. She had no idea what was down the road. This is the way it works. This is the way it works. So the question is, as we are where we're at now, are you open to the idea that God may be doing something through you? That God may have a plan and a purpose for you that you never would have dreamed, never would have envisioned a year or two ago. And I know Dorian and I've been talking. She's saying, Eric, because of my struggle, I used to help out with Messy Church. I used to do this. I used to do the other, and all these kind of things. But now, what is my place? What is my purpose? And I think that's a fantastic question. What is my purpose connected with the church? And I'm simply saying that God has a purpose for each person that is here. You can have an influence on people that I know that I can't. You can do things that I can't. You have a heart for things that I don't necessarily have a heart for. And there's this beautiful thing about it, as God brings a church together, that it's almost like the various elements that go into one of Chad's cakes. Because flour by itself is not very delicious, is it? No, not very nice. Sugar by itself is a bit OTT, right? And even, he likes making a carrot. Even carrots are okay by themselves and good and healthy. I mean, I like carrots. But boy, I tell you what, you take all those various bits and whip them together, shove it in the oven, and out pops this carrot cake. Woohoo! That's delish. That's delish. And I think that's the way a church works. Esther, is it possible that God has brought you to this place as queen for this time in history? Is it possible that God has brought you today? Is it possible that God has brought you into this church for such a time as this? So that was Mordecai's challenge to her. Is it possible? Is it possible, Esther? And then the last 3 verses, Esther's got a reply. She says, okay. Esther told them in verse 15, verse 16, she said, go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me. Again, she doesn't mention prayer. We could read between the lines maybe and not be wrong. neither eat nor drink for 3 days, day or night. My maids and I will fast likewise, and I will go to the king, which is against the law. Remember? If the king put out his scepter, then, yep, come in. If he doesn't, off with his head. Off with their head. Which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Wow. Wow. What a statement. What a statement. She says, I am ready to do this. She said, fast for me. Please don't eat or drink for 3 days. Might imply prayer, but we're not told outrightly. She said, I and my maids will fast also, and I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I die, then so be it. At least I died in a noble cause. We're trying to save the Jews. What a life. What a life. I want you to quickly turn with me to Daniel chapter 3. That is east in your Bible. Daniel chapter 3. Okay, it is after Ezekiel. Daniel chapter 3, if you want to follow along with me. This is the well-known story, the well-known chronicle, the well-known event of the 3 Hebrews before Nebuchadnezzar in that fiery furnace. There's a very similar thing going on here. The command was when all these sounds would go off that everyone was meant to bow down and worship this image. Remember all that? Remember that? Starting in verse 13. Notice what it says. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men to the king. Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods nor worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you're ready to, at the time you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, and the psaltery, and symphony with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of the fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to answer you in this matter. Verse 17. If that is the case, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us. There was the faith. He said, your king, your majesty, our God who we serve is able to deliver us. We know that he can. We have faith that he can. From the burning fiery furnace. And he will deliver us from your hand, O king. What a great statement of faith. Chuck me into that fire, and God's going to deliver me. Whew. You better say it. But then verse 18. I think is, again, one of the most powerful, incredible statements. But if not, O king, let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, nor will we worship the golden image which you have set up. And he said, Nebuchadnezzar, we believe that our God, we know that our God is able to deliver us. We believe that he will, but if he doesn't, I'm still not going to bow down and worship that golden image. What a statement. That's what Esther said. She said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to step out in faith. I'm going to approach the king. And if the king holds out a scepter, great. If he doesn't, so be it. So be it. In verse 17, and Esther finishes with, so Mordecai did as Esther wanted. She begins this